There is no such thing as a way. When we throw anything away, it must go somewhere.
Greetings and salutations, Planeswalkers of the Multiverse. This is Bones with Children of Alara, back again with another deck tech video for you. And we will be turning our attention this time to Muldrotha the Gravetide, a deck all about reduce, reuse, and recycle. And that's exactly how I broke up all the cards in this deck. How they fit into those three categories. Because that's what Muldrotha wants to do, since she lets you cast one permanent of each type out of your graveyard on your turn, which lets you reduce your opponent's resources, reuse your own cards multiple times, and in the end, recycle your way to victory. So without further ado, let's get started with the first step, which is reduce. And what better way to reduce your opponent's resources than by destroying all of them? This section consists of 5 cards: Phyrexian Scriptures, Oblivion Stone, Pernicious Deed, Nevinral's Disc, and Cyclonic Rift. So while Phyrexian Scriptures takes a little setup to destroy all non-artifact creatures, it then has the added benefit of exiling all cards from our opponent's graveyards, so it hoses other graveyard decks. It's also an enchantment, and enchantments aren't a very reusable card type to fulfill the one permanent of each type quota that Muldrotha gives us, so a very versatile and powerful, only 4 mana enchantment is a great fit in this deck. Both Oblivion Stone and Pernicious Deed fill similar roles, but being 2 different card types, artifact and enchantment, make them very versatile at only 3 mana. Since they both can destroy practically everything on the field, but depending on how much mana we want to put into them or how long we want to wait, we can save some of our resources so our board isn't completely set back to square one. And then there's Nevinral's Disc. Just wait a turn, then blow everything up. And then just bring it back with Muldrotha if you have the mana. And then there's Cyclonic Rift being one of 3 non-permanents in this deck. Even though I can't bring it back from the graveyard with my commander, it's just too good not to run. Plus I have some ways to recur it with permanents, just in case. But what if we don't want to blow up everything? What if we just want to blow up one thing? Well, we have a suite of cards just for that, being Reclamation Sage, Caustic Caterpillar, Seal of the Primordium, Acidic Slime, Executioner's Capsule, Seal of Doom, and Ravenous Chupacabra. Reclamation Sage, Acidic Slime, and Ravenous Chupacabra just destroy an artifact, enchantment, creature, land, whatever their card specifically does when they enter the battlefield, which is great because if we have a sack outlet and our commander, we can just 2-for-1 our opponents with just one of these cards. But some of my favorites in this category are the Rattlesnake cards: Caustic Caterpillar, Executioner's Capsule, Seal of Primordium, and Seal of Doom, because they just sit there on the battlefield and terrorize our opponents because we can use them whenever, but we won't necessarily use them. And if our commander's out, well, they're just coming back again. But Bones, Commander's a multiplayer format. You want to affect all the players, right? You'd be right, listeners. That's where Fleshbag Marauder and Plaguecrafter come into play, since they both make everybody sack a creature, or in Plaguecrafter's case, a creature or planeswalker. And if they can't, they have to discard a card. You're gonna get them one way or another. And then Dictate of Erebos gives us a flash enchantment that makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature when any of our creatures die. And believe me when I tell you, they're going to be dying. A lot. But it's okay, they'll be back soon. Now, for those cards you don't want to ever hit to the battlefield, we have some counter magic. Mystic Snake being a 2/2 body that just counters something when it enters the battlefield. Decent rate. But the real gem is Glenalendra Archmage, a 4-mana 2/2 that can sacrifice itself if you pay 1 blue mana in addition to counter a non-creature spell. But it also has Persist, so it can bring itself back before we reanimate it with our commander. You get so much mileage out of this one card. I love it. And your opponents usually hate it, which just makes me love it more. And the last 2 non-permanent cards in this deck are Disallow and Mana Drain. Disallow is just too versatile not to run, countering abilities, both activated and triggered, along with spells. It's just never a bad card to have in your hand. And Mana Drain gives you mana when you counter spells, and if they kill our commander a couple times, she gets kind of expensive. So having a way to stop a big master plan that your opponents have and accrue a lot of mana for your own shenanigans, it's also just phenomenal. The next 2 cards are for problematic permanents you don't want to put back into your opponent's graveyard or command zone, or hand. You just want them to be something else. And in this case, lands. Song of the Dryads and Imprisoned in the Moon do just that, turning problematic permanents into lands. They can't attack or block you, they're lands. They can't activate their scary ability, they're lands. Your opponent can't recast them from their graveyard or command zone, they're lands. All they can do is tap them for mana, because they're lands. Just in case your opponent plays a card that's just too spicy to pass up, Hostage Taker and Sower of Temptation will procure those creatures for you. Sower of Temptation lets you keep it for as long as you control Sower of Temptation. But if they kill Sower of Temptation, you can just recast it with your commander, and either take the creature back or pick a new target. Hostage Taker lets you take creatures or artifacts, and then you cast them as if they were your own, using mana as if it was any color. So then it's yours. So then you sacrifice Hostage Taker, and then you recast it with your commander, and you take something else. And then you just keep doing that over and over and over again, until you have all your opponent's stuff, in true pirate fashion. So we all know graveyard manipulation is a very popular theme in Commander. I mean, I'm doing a deck tech on one right now. But if our opponents are doing that, and we don't want them to be doing that, we have Nihil Spellbomb and Bojuka Bog to stop their shenanigans. The Spellbomb nets us a card if we have some open mana, and Bojuka Bog just comes in and exiles 1 graveyard. It also pairs fairly well with the cards in the next section, which some might view a little mean. So we've all played with that one player who ramps way too hard or has so deep pockets they actually can afford a Gaia's Cradle. And these next 4 cards are the land destruction pieces in the form of lands themselves: Ghost Quarter, Field of Ruin, Wasteland, and Dust Bowl. Now, I would like to preface this part by saying that land destruction is not a key component of this deck. It does not win by destroying everybody's lands. It does this just to keep people off a few of their utility lands, just nickel and dime them down in case they get out of control. Because, like I said, we've all played a game with that one green player who ramps way too hard and nobody can catch up with them. This just levels the playing field. Most can only hit non-basics anyway, so yeah. I mean, let's be honest, you already probably have your opinion on land destruction. So while not the nicest thing, a necessary evil in some cases. So we've reduced all of their creatures, all of their artifacts, enchantments, and some of their lands, and even their graveyard. But what about their life total? Sir Conrad the Grim is a great new inclusion to this deck, because he deals a damage to each opponent whenever a creature dies or is put into the graveyard from anywhere, or when a creature leaves your graveyard, like when it's brought back with your commander. But no, that's not enough for this uncommon. He also has an activated ability that lets you mill everybody for 1, fueling your graveyard strategy and possibly dealing damage to everybody by binning some creatures. So that's enough reducing. Now, what are the cards we're going to be reusing over and over and over again? Spore Frog and Siren Stormtamer are 2 very useful cards to defend us from 2 different points of attack. Spore Frog from literal attacks in the form of combat damage being fogged because sack it, fog, and Siren Stormtamer because you can sacrifice it and counter a spell or ability that targets us or our creatures. Kakusho the Evening Star is a dragon most veteran EDH players are familiar with. This card in this deck in particular, it just has a tendency to win games. You just loop it a couple of times and draining your opponents for 5 life each. You get so far ahead and they get so far behind, you just win. It's also a 5/5 flyer, so you can also attack them with it. Field of the Dead is a very useful card in this deck because if it or another land enters the battlefield under our control, and we control 7 lands with different names, you get a 2/2 zombie token. And being a 3-color deck, we have a lot of lands with different names. And when we can replay lands out of our graveyard, if that's the only land of that name, we can just keep replaying it and just keep making more zombies for chump blockers or fodder for sacrificing. Another useful land is Command Beacon, being able to put our commander from our command zone into our hand by sacrificing it. And then when we cast Muldrotha for 6 instead of whatever it is, because of command tax, we can just play Command Beacon for our land per turn out of the graveyard just in case they kill it. Muldrotha always costs 6 with Command Beacon. So in true value deck fashion, we have 3 planeswalkers, Vraska Golgari Queen, Vraska Relic Seeker, and Oko Thief of Crowns. The Golgari Queen's +2 is particularly useful because we sacrifice a permanent, doesn't matter what, and we gain a life and draw a card. And then if we have our commander out, or another reanimator, it just comes back. So we just net life, draw a card. -3, Abrupt Decay something. -9, you effectively win the game, but we don't care about that. We care about those top 2 abilities. Since we can recast our planeswalkers out of our graveyard, we don't care so much about reaching the ultimate, we care more about using them for incremental value just to slowly push the game in our favor. Now, the Relic Seeker is a little bit more expensive, but her +2 just gives us a token, just as sacrifice fodder, and the -3 just destroys an artifact, creature, enchantment, and gives us treasure to use later. And again, the -10 just effectively kills one person. And Oko. Oh, Oko. What hasn't been said about this card already? +2, make a food, who cares? +1, Elkify something. Artifact or a creature. It could be their commander. It could be anything. It's a nice Darksteel Forge you got there. It's an elk. This card's busted. It's really good in Commander. Especially when your commander can bring it back from the graveyard multiple times because it gets hated off the table. Oh, you will not make friends with this card. We have 2 tutors in this deck in the form of Sidisi Undead Vizier and Protean Hulk. And before you say anything, no, there is no combo with Protean Hulk, it just gets value. Because it's good enough as a value engine, not as a win con. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Now for card draw. We have Baleful Strix, Mystic Remora, Search for Iskanta, Solemn Simulacrum, and Coiling Oracle. And these are nice because most of them are different types, so if we have some in the graveyard and our commander out, we can play multiple of them each turn, drawing us a bunch of cards. Also, you don't care about paying the upkeep cost with Mystic Remora, you can just cast it out of your graveyard again. Search for Iskanta, you don't really want to flip, you want that card filtering, because effectively if you put the cards into your graveyard, you still have access to them with your commander. And Baleful Strix is just a 1/1 flying Death Touch flyer that also draws a card, and happens to be an artifact. The amount of times I've cast this as an artifact, and then cast a creature afterwards, is staggering, and then it just blocks, kills something, and then I just play it again. It's one of my favorite cards in this entire deck. And then Solemn Simulacrum and Coiling Oracle will lead into the next section, because Solemn Simulacrum gets me a basic when it enters the battlefield, and then draws me a card when it dies, which is all well and good. Coiling Oracle will either draw me a card or put a land onto the battlefield. So, you guessed it, the next part we're going to be talking about is Ramp. And the headliner for this section is Sakra Tribe Elder. For 2 mana, you get a 1/1 body that you just sack it, get a basic land onto the battlefield. Albeit tapped, but you can just do this over and over and over again until you have no more basics left in your deck. And then we have the usual ramp suspects, the Signets, Dimir, Simic, and Golgari in this case, as well as Chromatic Lantern and, you guessed it, Soul Ring. Now, normally I don't advocate for having fetch lands in a deck, apart from just smoothing your mana base, but in this type of deck where you get to play a land out of your graveyard because of your commander, the 3 fetch lands for your colors, Polluted Delta, Misty Rainforest, and Verdant Catacombs, are incredibly helpful, not only for ramping you, but thinning out your deck, making sure you're always having the right amount of colors. They're just so useful. I'm sorry they're so expensive, but they are just so useful in a Muldrotha deck. And the rest of the reuse section is the lands, at least the ones that aren't in the recycling section. They're just going to be all up here. It's kind of what you expected. Things that tap for Sultai colors, shocks, pain lands, check lands, basics, all that good stuff. It'll be here. So, final stretch. Let's take a look at the cards that do all the recycling. That's right, the cards that keep getting you value for your cards over and over and over again. Starting with a pair that turns creatures into other creatures, Fiend Artisan and Birthing Pod. Birthing Pod upgrading the sacrificed creature into a creature with 1+ in its converted mana cost, and Fiend Artisan, a new offering from Ikoria, that not only gets bigger based on the number of creatures in your graveyard, but also can search for exactly what you need, barring that you have the mana to cast it and a creature to sacrifice. So it just gets exactly what you need at sorcery speed, but whatever, the card's still very good. Greater Good turns creatures into cards, and then you have to discard 3 cards, which is still just card advantage in a deck like this. Razaketh the Foul-Blooded is not only an 8/8 Flamplar, but also has an ability that's sort of a combination of Diabolical Intent and Vampiric Tutor. You sack a creature, you pay 2 life, you tutor for anything. Any black deck probably wants to run this card. An 8 mana, 8/8 flying trample, sack outlet, tutor that checks all the boxes. Viscera Sierra is a very cheap sack outlet that lets you fix the top of your deck whenever you have a creature to throw away. Ashnod's Altar is a mana generating machine, great for ramping out big spells quicker and filling up our graveyard with things to replay. You can even sack a creature to Ashnod's Altar and then use the mana generated by the altar to recast said creature. We have a pair of lands, High Market and Mirren the Moaning Well, which are great for sacking creatures to gain us a little bit of life, throw things in the graveyard just to keep us in the game a little longer. High Market doesn't even have a cost, you just tap it, sack a creature, gain a life. Great if somebody tries to exile a creature right off your board. Mirren the Moaning Well can gain you more life, but it does cost an additional 3 mana. But sometimes that's worth it. Gerard Golgari Lichlord not only gets bigger, much like the Fiend Artisan for all the creatures in our graveyard, but also we can sacrifice a creature to make each opponent lose life equal to the creature's power. Another good way to close out a game if things have gone on a little bit too long and you have a few creatures you can throw at everybody's face. And he even has built-in recursion. You sacrifice a swamp and a forest, it comes back to your hand. We don't even need our commander to get him back. Well, what if our commander's too expensive or we just don't have it out? How are we going to be getting all these creatures out of the graveyard? Well, we have a small collection of cards that do just that, even if our commander isn't in play. Animate Dead does just that, animates the dead. It's also a cheap enchantment that we can keep looping with Muldrotha if we have a sack outlet. Also helpful to get Muldrotha back if someone destroys it and it just happens to be in our hand. And it can also get cards out of our opponent's graveyard. Someone has, I don't know, an Elishnorn, an Avacyn, something neat. 2 mana, it's ours. Marin of Clan Nel Toth is a powerful commander in her own right, but in this deck she also shines. Since those experience counters go on us, if she happens to die and we reanimate her, all those experience counters still count when her ability checks at the end of turn, constantly bringing back creatures at the end of turn, or at minimum to our hand. Journey to Eternity not only saves a creature from dying at least once, it then flips into mana that taps for any color and has the added ability of returning a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield for 5 mana. Now that's a rate I am fine with when it's attached to a land that's most likely not going to be destroyed. And Eternal Witness returns anything to our hand. Can't really go wrong with that for 3 mana. Especially when we can loop it with our sack outlets. Don't forget, recycle, recycle, recycle. Ramanap Excavator is Crucible of Worlds with legs, or in this case, without legs. I like it a little bit more than Crucible in this deck, purely because I have a lot of things that sacrifice creatures, so having more creatures to use as resources in addition to their effects is just better in my opinion. And the Gitrog monster, once again, powerful commander, great in this deck, letting us play additional lands, drawing us cards when our lands go to the graveyard, and putting lands into our graveyard sometimes is a good thing, because if we miss our land drop, well, we can just play those lands out of the graveyard with our commander, or Ramunap Excavator. It's also a giant death-touching frog. What more do you want? Underrealm Lich is kind of like a Search for Azcanta 2.0. Instead of drawing cards, I look at the top 3, pick the best one, put the rest into the graveyard. Again, it's like drawing 3 cards in a deck like this. It also can protect itself by paying 4 life and becoming indestructible. Doom Whisperer is another giant Flampler. This one with the added benefit of paying 2 life and Surveil 2. Again, it's like drawing a card. If you like the cards on top, leave them there. If you want to cast them this turn, put them in the graveyard. Muldrotha gets you them a turn early. You gotta be careful with the next card, because Dream Halls affects everybody, granting the ability to discard a card that shares a color with the spell you're about to cast instead of paying its mana cost. So that Doom Whisperer we just mentioned, discard a Seal of Doom, get a free Doom Whisperer. And since we're playing things out of our graveyard, just cast the Seal of Doom for funsies. Unless your opponents are also playing either a discard or graveyard deck, this is just going to be a discount on spells, but this also gives us an advantage because we can cast things out of our graveyard. We don't lose anything out of this exchange. It's just a positive for us. And lastly, Gravebreaker Lamia is an Entomb on a 4/4 lifelinking body that discounts playing spells from our graveyard, which is exactly what this deck wants to do, recycling on a budget. And that's the 99, all the cards that I use in my Muldrotha deck. But according to EDHREC, Muldrotha is the most popular commander right now. So now, I want to hear from the Muldrotha players out there. Is there any card that I overlooked in my list that you are aghast that I missed? Or is there some new tech that I turned you on to? Let me know in the ether down below. And while you're there, you can head to TCGPLAYER through our affiliate link to pick up those cards and help the channel out at the same time. If you want to help the channel even more, we have a Patreon as well. Every little bit helps, and there's even a tier where I can do a deck tech video about a deck you've made, or build a brand new deck for you. I hope you've enjoyed this look at my Muldrotha deck. If you did, please like this video so YouTube can tell my brain to produce some serotonin. And if you want more from us, subscribe and ring that temple bell to get all the updates happening here at Children of Alara. Lastly, I'll leave you all with some advice as I close out the video. Take out the bad cards and put in the good cards. I've been Bones with Children of Alara, and I'll see you at the beginning of your end step.